The royal court had long grown accustomed to navigating internal crises, maintaining institutional silence, and weathering public controversies. Nevertheless, the household found itself entirely unready for the gravity that arrived when Prince William finally gave voice to the final directives left behind by Queen Elizabeth. This was far from being another unverified rumor, a passing murmur, or a strategic media briefing managed behind the elegant, closed doors of the palace. It represented a deliberate, definitive instruction regarding the royal status of Camilla and the strict boundaries attached to it, an order that could not be brushed aside. Before exploring what this development portends for the sovereign lineage, remember to hit the subscribe button to catch every future analysis. Stepping into the secluded chamber, William carried the profound composure of someone who had already reconciled with the emotional consequences of his impending declaration. There was no haste in the prince's demeanor, nor did he attempt to soften the heavy quiet hanging in the air. By placing the leather folder upon the desk and directing his gaze toward Charles and then toward Camilla, he ensured everyone present understood this was no longer a personal family talk disguised as a matter of state. Instead, it was state duty finally shattering the boundaries of a family talk. The royal title, the official designation and rank establishing an individual standing alongside the sovereign, had ceased to be a mere matter of grand ritual. It now stood as the exact boundary where personal devotion concluded and constitutional power began. Even before the reality was articulated, Charles felt that shift. As William disclosed a verified, confidential document preserved from the final months of the late sovereign's life, the king cast his eyes downward. According to those final words, Camilla's rank had to remain strictly honorific, bound exclusively to his own time on the throne, and never permitted to wield autonomous power over the coming monarchy. Charles raised no objections, choosing instead to fixate on the papers as though the immense weight of his mother's final judgment had traveled across the room to rest directly upon his shoulders. The emotional toll on him was devastating because it pulled him in two opposite directions: his profound loyalty to his wife versus his lifelong vow of obedience to the ruler who had molded his entire existence. Camilla remained entirely motionless. As the gravity of the situation settled over the room, the queen consort sat paralyzed. Her official designation was not being stripped away, nor was her public honor being openly destroyed, but the exact reach of her influence was being legally mapped out. That specific mapping carried a profound sting. Precedence, the rigid protocol governing who takes the lead, who speaks at functions, and who embodies the state within court life, now held a significance greater than ever before. Courtiers recognized that this was not a simple dispute over administrative vocabulary. It fundamentally altered ceremonial oversight, future successions, and Camilla's standing next to the throne. When the conversation shifted toward the future awaiting William and Catherine, the prince brought the folder to a slow close, the sound marking the definitive end of one historical chapter before the next could even unfold. William noted that only a highly restricted circle had been made aware of this directive, as there was a collective desire to shield the family from this painful confrontation for as long as possible. He then made it clear that another individual needed to face the late Queen's unfiltered words without any institutional delay, protective shielding, or carefully managed court diplomacy. That individual was Camilla herself. However, prior to Camilla confronting the mandates left by the late sovereign, the household was forced to look directly at the agonizing reality gripping everyone within those walls. A deep human vulnerability existed beneath every official rank, and this sudden disclosure laid all of them bare at the exact same moment. William bore the immense weight of future leadership, while Charles endured the ache of a fractured allegiance. Meanwhile, Camilla experienced the sudden shock of seeing her title ringed by strict limitations, and Catherine, keeping a quiet but highly perceptive watch, recognized that the monarch's final decree stretched far beyond historical grievances. It was designed to safeguard the tomorrow waiting for her. The moment those sentences left his lips, William recognized that the dynamics of the room had shifted permanently. He was no longer acting merely as a son addressing his father, he was the future sovereign shielding the structural integrity of the crown before personal sentiments could distort it. This explained the profound importance of the directive. It was not drafted to inflict pain on a specific woman or to bring shame upon a particular era of rule. It was created because the crown, existing as a continuous institution handed down from one ruler to the next, cannot endure ambiguity at its highest levels of authority. Had Camilla's status been permitted to expand beyond a purely ceremonial role, the future position of Catherine might have been dragged into destabilizing uncertainty long before her time arrived. While Charles perceived that systemic threat, he was equally sensitive to the underlying harshness of the situation. For decades, the king had labored to shield Camilla from public condemnation, historical memory, and the persistent shadows of old grievances that had never truly faded away. Now, he was being forced to concede that the final intentions of his mother still carried greater weight than his own marital devotion. Turning his gaze toward the queen consort, his prolonged silence conveyed what he could not bring himself to say aloud. He cherished her, he had fought to choose her, but he had also inherited a throne anchored by principles far older than any private vow he had ever uttered. The distress felt by Camilla showed itself through a subtle gesture. She took a firm hold of her chair's framework, not with any theatrical display or loud exclamation, but with a tightness that did not escape Catherine's notice. The queen consort fully grasped the reality hidden beneath the sophisticated phrasing. Though her rank was to be treated with ongoing respect, that respect was entirely distinct from institutional command. She could still occupy a place next to Charles, participate in grand state occasions, and project public grace. Nevertheless, the late monarch's directive erected a permanent barrier between her specific role and the future of the crown. While that barrier remained invisible to the public outside the gates, its sudden ascent was deeply felt by everyone inside the palace walls. With quiet anxiety, Catherine kept her eyes on William. She was well aware that maintaining such a composed delivery was demanding an immense personal toll from him. By openly challenging the household of Charles, the prince was stepping directly into a historical family wound that had never truly closed, and the future queen understood precisely why he had postponed this confrontation for as long as he could. Even so, the existence of the document made it obvious that Queen Elizabeth had identified this constitutional danger long before the rest of the family was prepared to acknowledge it. The ruler had not acted out of sudden panic, but out of profound institutional foresight. At that moment, a senior court official pushed a sealed packet across the table. Though the movement itself was entirely noiseless, it impacted the room with the force of a sudden confession. Containing multiple pages, the text did not point toward what lay ahead, instead, it directed their attention backward. As the family examined the late sovereign's underlying logic more closely, it became undeniable that a single, overlooked historical incident had set this entire crisis into motion. Every institutional crisis can be traced back to an event that initially appears inconsequential, until history reverses its gaze and points directly to its origin. For Queen Elizabeth, that specific moment unfolded during a confidential Windsor title consultation, where an ordinary discussion regarding court protocol rapidly evolved into an institutional warning. What transpired within that private chamber did not result in an immediate public explosion. Instead, it did something far more hazardous by remaining concealed, hardening over time, and waiting for its moment to surface. William understood precisely why that sealed sheet carried a greater weight than the folder enclosing it. Having witnessed numerous court upheavals, the prince knew that genuine peril rarely announces itself with raised voices. Instead, it begins with meticulously selected vocabulary, softened assertions, and quiet political pressure applied in spaces far removed from public hearing. This was what gave that past Windsor title consultation such immense significance. A title consultation was a confidential deliberation regarding how royal names, official ranks, and formal roles would function within the state apparatus. This particular meeting had been convened on the heels of a memorial service, a time when personal emotions were already highly vulnerable. During that meeting, the political strategists advising Camilla had pushed for specific phrasing that would realign her title closer to sovereign authority, a move that would grant her a sliver of the distinct power traditionally reserved solely for the ruling monarch. The Queen had listened without showing any immediate anger. With William standing close by, Charles in attendance, and a high-ranking courtier monitoring every deliberate pause, the tension in the room began to mount. What initially presented itself as a minor dispute over terminology quickly transformed into something else entirely. In an effort to keep the deliberation from turning directly against Camilla, Charles tried to soften the collective tone, but the real damage was done by a single phrase: shared royal authority. The king, who was then still a prince serving under his mother's sovereign rule, recognized instantly that the wording had crossed an impermissible line. He attempted to redirect the conversation back toward a purely ceremonial framework, but the monarch had already detected the systemic warning masked by the sophisticated language. Before anyone could verbalize it, William noticed the shift. His grandmother set her pen down without concluding her written memorandum, a minimal gesture that instantly froze the entire room. The prince never forgot that moment. The queen's reaction was not characterized by open anger, it was something far colder and more unwavering, because she understood exactly what was being put to the test. If Camilla's rank could be pushed past public respect and into constitutional authority, the future lineage of the crown could eventually be obscured by personal sentiments, marital loyalties, and conflicting spheres of political influence. The monarch took decisive action once that consultation drew to a close. She privately dictated the exact directive that now occupied the center of this current crisis, defining Camilla's place as deeply honored yet strictly limited, deserving of respect, but completely devoid of sovereign reach. This file was never born out of personal animosity, which was the painful misinterpretation that Camilla would later feel most acutely. It was born out of profound institutional fear. It was a fear that during some future royal transition, the state might fail to maintain a clear distinction between the woman standing beside the king and the sovereign crown that would one day be inherited by William and Catherine. Charles grappled intensely with that reality because it transformed his personal love into a constitutional dilemma. Camilla would find herself struggling because it made her personal honor feel entirely conditional, and William would struggle because that past consultation had turned into an emotional weapon that nobody wished to wield, yet everyone now recognized had to be brought into the light. Yet, a hidden directive can only remain unspoken for a limited duration. The moment Camilla finally heard those words delivered face to face, the fragile peace within the palace shattered. Though the gathering had opened with strict adherence to court protocol, it quickly abandoned that formal structure. No palace courtiers stepped in to mediate, and no media relations official was present to soften the emotional blow. William stood directly across from Camilla with the late queen's mandate hanging between them, while Charles remained agonizingly motionless by his wife's side. The resulting quiet was far from empty, it was thick with decades of personal sacrifice, deep-seated resentment, marital loyalty, and the one fundamental question that nobody possessed the courage to utter aloud. William had initiated this face-to-face meeting because the protective shield of diplomatic court language had finally dissolved. The prince recognized that when too many intermediaries stand between personal pain and absolute truth, that truth loses its strength with every carefully managed phrase. He refused to allow any institutional buffer to exist now, no specific palace office communicating on behalf of another, and no strategic advisor translating state duty into a gentler reality. Charles recognized the immediate peril of that tactical choice. A confidential royal dialogue, meaning an intimate family discussion where major policies are hammered out before turning into official decrees, could either mend what had been fractured or completely expose the grievances everyone had worked to keep buried. Before the first definitive statement was even voiced, Camilla felt the mounting psychological weight. Looking directly at William, the queen consort inquired whether he truly believed she had exceeded her permissible boundaries. Her delivery remained steady, yet that single inquiry carried decades of accumulated judgment within it. The prince offered his reply with excruciating precision. He explained that the mandate had never been drafted to inflict personal shame upon her, but rather because the late sovereign viewed distinct boundaries as an absolute necessity. That specific word altered the entire atmosphere of the room, boundaries. It did not imply outright rejection or forced isolation, but a line demarcated so clearly that even the highest personal honor could not step across it without facing immediate institutional consequences. At that point, Charles pushed back with a quiet yet undeniable force. The king questioned why his mother's directive had to be dragged into the open at this specific moment, after the family had already endured such extensive public damage. He asked why this was happening after Camilla had survived decades of public scrutiny, and just as his own time on the throne had finally found its footing. He was not acting out of personal ambition, he was shielding the woman who stood by his side. Nevertheless, William refused to allow personal affection to rewrite constitutional structure. The prince was well aware that the crown had managed to endure through the centuries precisely because personal devotion consistently yielded to institutional frameworks, and that specific framework mattered because the future monarchy would eventually belong to himself and Catherine, rather than to the unresolved emotional entanglements of the current court. William proceeded to read the crucial sentence aloud: Camilla's rank must never be leveraged to sway the standing of the future queen. Those words hit the room with absolute, uncompromising clarity. The term future queen pointed directly to Catherine, the woman destined to stand beside William when the next era of rule arrived, and the late sovereign's mandate functioned to insulate her role before any institutional ambiguity could manifest around it. Camilla finally perceived the full weight of what had been kept from her. Her ceremonial influence was not merely being evaluated, it was being explicitly restricted. Charles reached out his hand to take the document, but William intentionally withheld it for a brief moment. That calculated delay communicated far more than an outright refusal ever could. The prince was not trying to keep a piece of paper away from his father, he was preserving direct control over the mandate itself. Whoever held physical possession of that document wielded the ultimate power to dictate exactly what Camilla's rank could and could not signify. That brief hesitation laid bare the profound conflict over power churning beneath the dispute over titles. The issue was no longer what official name Camilla would hold, but rather who maintained ultimate control over the future of the crown. Within a ruling monarchy, titles are never merely names on paper, they dictate physical access, official precedence, political influence, and historical memory. The late queen grasped that reality more profoundly than anyone else. Consequently, when her final mandate came to light, it did not simply bruise Camilla's personal pride, it laid bare the raw engineering operating beneath the royal velvet, clarifying who possessed the authority to sign state papers, who could offer counsel, who was permitted to enter the private chambers, and who held the constitutional right to shape the future. William recognized that this was the exact reality that nobody wanted articulated in open conversation. While Camilla's rank continued to encompass formal ceremony, public respect, and institutional grace, the written instructions explicitly severed symbolic visibility from genuine governing influence. Ceremony represented the public obligations, the formal welcomes, the media appearances, and the honorifics that define court life. Influence, however, constituted something far more potent, the authority to steer state decisions, regulate personal access to the sovereign, and dictate how the next era of rule would be organized. The prince knew that maintaining this distinction was vital, because while the monarchy could weather personal discomfort, it could never survive fragmented authority at its absolute summit. Charles stared intensely at the phrasing as if every single line had been drafted to pierce his heart. The king had spent decades proving to the world that Camilla belonged by his side, and now he was being forced to admit that this belonging did not grant her unrestricted institutional reach. A high-ranking court official observed how long the king remained focused on the page without making a move to turn it. That prolonged quiet revealed everything to the room. Charles was not simply reading the restrictions his mother had imposed on Camilla, he was absorbing the reality that the late monarch had meticulously engineered a future where his marital affection would never be permitted to restructure the crown. Away from the intense atmosphere of that chamber, Catherine experienced the emotional toll in a completely different manner. Sitting in a quiet space, she left a cup of tea entirely untouched, deeply unsettled by the realization that her future standing was being insulated through intense family conflict. The future queenly position signified the exact place Catherine would eventually occupy beside William when he ascended the throne, and the late sovereign's text protected that standing before any administrative ambiguity could collect around it. She harbored no desire for an open conflict with Camilla, nor did she require one. Even so, the late queen's written words had placed her squarely at the center of an institutional struggle she had worked so meticulously to avoid. It was then that William uncovered a deeper truth within the palace administration. Specific court offices had possessed enough knowledge of the document to maintain absolute silence over the years. They had intentionally avoided raising any discussion about the directive because nobody wished to force Charles into making an agonizing choice between the woman sharing his life and the mother who had ruled before him. While that bureaucratic avoidance had successfully maintained a temporary peace, it had also permitted institutional uncertainty to fester. Moving forward, every ceremonial decision involving Camilla would be subjected to far more rigorous institutional scrutiny. Whenever those decisions brushed against succession symbolism, future protocols, or the impending role of Catherine, Camilla would feel the administrative adjustments long before the public ever perceived them. The queen consort retained her public honor, but that honor was now bound by clear limitations. The moment those restrictions shifted from confidential pages into the daily operations of court life, the initial practical consequences began to manifest. While the palace administration was fully capable of absorbing a private family dispute, it possessed no way to conceal the practical structural adjustments that immediately followed. Those specific changes cut directly into the daily reality of Camilla's court life. The institutional fallout did not manifest through dramatic shouting matches. Instead, it arrived in the form of altered daily schedules, deleted official initials, delayed administrative approvals, and doors that failed to open with their former ease. For Camilla, the resulting loss of face remained entirely hidden from the public at first. It operated in a far quieter fashion, a high-level briefing to which she received no invitation, a ceremonial memorandum completely rewritten, or a palace corridor where every staff member suddenly possessed full knowledge of the situation yet nobody dared articulate the reason why. Camilla perceived the shift long before anyone offered an official explanation. The Queen Consort arrived for a scheduled briefing, the exact type of controlled palace discussion where official obligations were systematically organized, public appearances were refined, and every royal title was positioned precisely where it belonged. This time, however, the scope of the gathering had been drastically curtailed. Her chief advisor was absent from the room, and the agenda had been heavily restricted. A staff member, speaking with immense care yet visibly shaken, informed her that the session had been modified into a downsized format. That lone statement carried all the weight of an open slight, even though no public voice had actually uttered it. The office of William characterized these adjustments as an administrative clarification rather than any form of personal punishment. The prince maintained that the operational changes simply mirrored the institutional boundaries established by the late queen, rather than representing any coordinated personal campaign targeting Camilla. Nonetheless, the palace staff understood the deeper constitutional reality. Ceremonial protocols, the rigid regulations dictating how royal roles are managed during formal state events, were being systematically recalibrated whenever Camilla's rank intersected with succession imagery. Succession imagery encompassed the specific symbols, official terminology, and seating arrangements that pointed directly toward the next era of rule. This carried immense weight because Catherine's future standing could not be left exposed to ambiguous language, fragmented authority, or emotional pressure radiating from the current reign. Charles refused to accept this operational shift in silence. The king brought a folder to a sharp slam directly in front of his aides, the abrupt noise cutting through the room like an explicit warning. He understood precisely what was unfolding before him. Private family distress had officially hardened into administrative reality. What had initiated as a confidential, sealed instruction was now actively reshaping calendars, official briefings, state programs, and personal access. Charles had survived fierce public controversies throughout his life, but this particular wound felt entirely different because it came wrapped in the absolute authority of his late mother. He could make a stand for Camilla using his personal love, but he could not easily challenge the late queen without fundamentally eroding the constitutional crown he had inherited from her hands. Camilla identified the next structural blow nestled within a formal state program. Her official title remained printed upon the page, elegant and unmarred. Yet, the surrounding text had been completely altered. The language no longer implied any institutional influence extending beyond the duration of Charles's reign, nor did it permit anyone to mistake public respect for official command. The Queen Consort recognized the profound cruelty embedded within that delicate balance. She was honored sufficiently to stand next to the king, yet limited sufficiently to be constantly reminded that the future did not belong to her. William gave his quiet approval to these operational changes after reviewing the late queen's directive one more time in solitude. The prince bore no look of triumph. Instead, he appeared deeply burdened. Every official signature he appended moved him one step further from the personal comfort of being a son, and drew him deeper into the isolated discipline required of a future king. The mounting crisis now demanded something far greater than mere administrative rules. It required a definitive turning point. That turning point could never be achieved through bureaucratic offices, state papers, or ceremonial revisions. As the palace doors began to close, only one face-to-face dialogue retained the power to prevent the family from fracturing entirely. On occasion, the survival of a ruling dynasty is secured not through grand state ceremonies, but through two individuals communicating with absolute honesty when removed from public scrutiny. William and Charles had positioned themselves on diametrically opposed sides of the late Queen's directive. Yet, beneath their official titles, they remained a son and a father navigating profound grief in completely different forms. Within that private space, the political battle over Camilla's rank transformed into something far more agonizing, a raw confrontation involving personal love, constitutional duty, and the enduring shadow of the late queen. William had requested this face-to-face meeting because the institutional crisis had escalated too far to be managed by bureaucratic offices. The prince refused to allow any aides, advisors, or carefully managed court language to stand between himself and his father. Charles consented to the meeting, though not because he felt emotionally prepared for it. He agreed because the king recognized that their prolonged silence had already inflicted severe institutional damage. The directive had officially migrated from a sealed piece of paper into the daily machinery of court life, and now father and son were forced to confront exactly what it had done to their relationship. A private conversation within a royal framework signified something far greater than two family members talking in isolation. It represented the final moment before a deep family wound hardened into an official state policy, the absolute last opportunity to speak from the heart before institutional duty solidified everything into unyielding governance. Charles entered the room bearing the profound exhaustion of a man carrying both the weight of the crown and a breaking heart. The king's eyes caught a framed photograph of Queen Elizabeth resting nearby, and for a brief moment, the entire chamber appeared to belong to her spirit far more than to either of the men standing within it. With a rare, vulnerable softness, he confessed that he felt as though he was being ordered to wage a campaign against Camilla on behalf of his own mother. That admission struck William with a force far greater than any display of anger could have achieved. The prince had steeled himself for fierce resistance and had prepared to assert his future authority, but he was entirely unready for the raw grief sounding in his father's voice, the specific kind of heartbreak that suddenly makes every rigid royal rule feel intensely human. William chose his words with extreme care, recognizing that a single miscalculated phrase could tear open every historical wound. He informed Charles that his actions were never designed to diminish Camilla as an individual, rather, he was working to insulate the crown from the exact constitutional ambiguity that the late queen had explicitly feared. This was of paramount importance because the crown represented far more than the physical individual wearing it at any given moment. It embodied the continuous line of public trust that transported the monarchy from one era of rule to the next. Had Camilla's rank been permitted to expand past a purely honorific status, the future standing of Catherine would have been subjected to immense institutional pressure long before William's own reign could even commence. The prince desperately needed his father to recognize that this action was not born out of historical revenge, but out of necessary institutional protection. Charles finally conceded to the reality he had spent years avoiding articulating aloud. The late sovereign's directive was real, and it was absolutely binding. It was binding not because it offered an easy path, and certainly not because it spared anyone's feelings. It had been issued by the very monarch who had constructed the modern era of rule through unyielding discipline, immense patience, and personal sacrifice. The king knew that while he could privately resent the emotional pain it inflicted, he possessed no constitutional right to pretend it held no legal authority. William extended the only institutional mercy within his power to grant. Camilla would consistently be treated with utmost public dignity, and her title would remain fully respected by the court. However, it would never be permitted to restructure the future role awaiting Catherine, nor would it be allowed to blur the clarity of the monarchy's next chapter. Father and son arrived at a delicate, fragile understanding. It was not an accord warm enough to mend their personal relationship entirely, but it possessed sufficient strength to prevent their institutional fracture from becoming permanent. Yet, private concessions made within the palace walls counted for absolutely nothing until the outside world perceived the structural shift and formed its own verdict. By the arrival of morning, the narrative no longer belonged exclusively to the family. It was now the property of Britain, major news broadcasters, national newspapers, the crowds gathering outside the palace gates, and every citizen who recognized that royal titles are never merely ornamental. The late Queen's final mandate had officially crossed the line from a private family inheritance into the arena of public judgment, and a single newspaper front page transformed the entire crisis into a defining national image. William was well aware that his confidential understanding with Charles could never remain private for long. While the prince had acknowledged and validated his father's personal pain, the nation was now being asked to accept the structural consequences. A prominent national newspaper broke the narrative in a manner that no polished palace press release could possibly soften. The publication placed images of William, Charles, and Camilla directly beneath a stark, five-word headline, "The Queen's Final Line." Those specific words struck the nation with immense force because they reduced a complex crisis to a simple reality. The late sovereign had drawn a definitive boundary, William had brought it into the light, Charles had accepted its terms, and Camilla was now forced to live within its limits. television broadcasters seized upon the profound implications immediately. They framed the sudden disclosure not as a hostile stripping away of rank, but as a historic, vital clarification of Camilla's role, a definitive limitation that fundamentally altered the emotional equilibrium of the current reign. This mattered immensely because the public had traditionally viewed royal titles as simple tokens of public honor. Yet, this unfolding narrative demonstrated to the country that titles also functioned as potent instruments of institutional power. A rank possessed the capability to open doors, regulate political access, and dictate how the future of the state was organized. Viewers were now being informed that the late monarch had actively insulated that future from beyond the grave, leaving William as the individual force to execute her final boundary. Camilla felt the full weight of public scrutiny long before the palace administration could finalize its official response. The Queen Consort encountered the front page during breakfast, folded the publication a single time, and left it resting next to her plate, abandoning her tea unfinished. She required no intermediary to explain the profound public loss of face. While her official rank remained formally respected, the entire nation had now looked directly at the boundary enclosing it. Her private distress had officially been mapped into a public reality. For Charles, this development represented yet another devastating blow. The king had spent a lifetime trying to protect her from being reduced to a lightning rod for public controversy. Yet, the very directive engineered to preserve the structural integrity of the crown had exposed her personal pain to the entire country. Outside Buckingham Palace, a modest crowd assembled in an uncomfortable, tense quiet. Some individuals arrived out of enduring loyalty to the memory of the late queen, while others gathered because they could sense history actively shifting in real time. An elderly woman within the crowd voiced the exact sentiment that cut through the ambient noise: the queen knew what had to be protected. The assertion was simple, yet it perfectly captured the collective mood of that morning. The public was not merely reacting to Camilla as an individual, they were responding to William, to Catherine, to Charles, and to the structural future of the monarchy, which had suddenly been rendered visible through the lens of an old, hidden directive. Palace communications officials eventually released a meticulously managed statement, affirming the court's deep respect for Camilla while explicitly confirming that all future successions and protocols would strictly mirror the late queen's mandate. Precedents signified the exact hierarchy of rank and importance within court life, and that structural order had now been publicly and permanently tied to the future standing of Catherine. Media commentators grasped the deeper, shocking reality under the surface. Catherine had never been forced to wage a campaign for her own protection, the late sovereign had already provided that security decades prior, and William had merely acted to reveal what had already been definitively settled. With the public now fully aware of the reality, the household could no longer retreat behind a shield of silence. The fundamental question had shifted from what had occurred within the private chambers of the palace to what this meant for every citizen touched by the power of the crown. When the media noise finally began to recede, what remained was not a passing tabloid scandal, but the unyielding, painful verdict Queen Elizabeth had left behind. When all was said and done, the sudden disclosure did not bring about the destruction of the monarchy. Instead, it provided vital structural clarity. The late Queen's final directive did not function to erase Camilla from history, humiliate Charles as a king, or place the crown upon William's head ahead of his time. It accomplished something far colder, vastly wiser, and infinitely more permanent. It drew an absolute line between personal affection and constitutional authority, between honorific titles and actual state power, and between the woman standing beside the current king and the future waiting beyond his reign. William recognized that this final judgment had never been driven by personal anger. The prince had not stepped into the arena as a rebellious son attempting to overpower his father, he had stepped forward explicitly as the institutional guardian of a boundary the late monarch believed the crown absolutely required to survive. In plain terms, the crown was far more than a physical, jeweled object placed upon a sovereign's head during a coronation. It represented the continuous authority, unbroken duty, and public trust that traveled from one era of rule to the next. This explained why this historical moment carried such immense significance. It insulated the future from administrative confusion and forced the current reign to accept structural limits. Charles accepted the finality of the decision without launching another counterargument. The king placed the confidential file back upon the desk, his fingers brushing its edge as if he were silently bidding farewell to a constitutional battle he no longer possessed the power to win. He had defended Camilla with unwavering marital loyalty and had carried her through media storms that would have easily shattered weaker hearts. Now, however, he was forced to confront the agonizing truth. While personal love could fully explain his past resistance, it possessed no power to erase his mother's legal instruction. The late sovereign had spent a lifetime teaching her family that state duty must consistently take precedence over personal desires, and now that profound lesson had returned to him in its most challenging possible form. Camilla met the conclusion of this chapter in absolute silence. The queen consort did not erupt in anger, did not demand a secondary hearing from the council, and made no attempt to transform her personal dignity into open defiance. She stood entirely alone in the chamber after the doors came to a close, deeply wounded by the explicit knowledge that while her title remained honored, it was meticulously ringed by limits. A royal title, meaning the official formal rank that defines an individual's standing within the state hierarchy, could easily secure public respect, ceremonial visibility, and social grace. Yet, it could never automatically grant ultimate constitutional power. Camilla recognized now that quiet acceptance represented the sole pathway to preserving the personal dignity she still possessed. The future standing of Catherine now stood permanently insulated, achieved not through petty palace rivalries, but through the late Queen's final, deliberate act of constitutional judgment. William had brought to light what the late sovereign had left behind, ensuring that Catherine's place next to him was no longer exposed to ambiguous language or private family pressure. That was the profound revelation resting beneath the surface of the scandal. Camilla could happily stand next to Charles, but she was completely powerless to redefine the era that would follow him. This historic moment signified that the late Queen's reign continued to actively shape the destiny of the monarchy even after her passing. William proved to the nation that he would unyieldingly shield its future, while Charles paid the immense emotional price demanded by institutional loyalty. Meanwhile, Camilla discovered that holding public honor devoid of ultimate authority was still a position of respect, but it would never equate to state command. This was the final, true meaning of the Queen's instruction. The crown could easily display mercy, personal affection, and public respect, but when the structural future of the monarchy was hanging in the balance, constitutional duty claimed the final word. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next.